I'm sure you've noticed this, that there's still no clarity on who's going to govern in some of the big metros around the country. So Nelson Mandela Bay, Tshwane, Joburg, Ekurhuleni, those in particular. We can see some of the discussions. We know the ANC and the EFF have been talking. We don't know where those conversations are. There are other conversations involving the IFP, the DA, Herman Mashaba's Action South Africa. Jennica Beukes is a doctoral researcher at the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape. Jennica, good afternoon to you, and thanks for your time. I mean, look, we don't really know what's going on in these discussions. I'm prepared to guess, but we don't really know. People are talking. How important is it to have proper coalition agreements? Wherever we go, people are saying they will actually have coalition agreements. How important is that?
Hi, Stephen. Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, coalition agreements are really important. In fact, in the literature, they refer to it as the Bible of the coalition, because essentially the coalition agreement is a point of reference of the negotiated settlement among the political parties. So it sets out how the political parties intend to make decisions, whether it would be made jointly on a consensus basis, for example. It sets out how they intend to resolve disputes in the case that a conflict will arise. It sets out the program of the coalition, so what they intend to achieve over the 5-year council term. And it also sets out what are the negotiables, the non-negotiables, and how far the political parties are willing to compromise. So it may also reflect in some instances those issues that they are not willing to compromise on. So it serves as a point of reference for the political parties to go back on, and in order to remind their coalition partners of the agreement that they made in the initial process before establishing the coalition agreement.
I've been trying to rack my brain, and I can't remember actually seeing a coalition agreement. It's not something that we've seen very often in South Africa, them being made public. If they are made public, is that going to make a difference? And I ask that because the coalitions we've had up until now have been a bit of a disaster.
Yeah. Well, that's precisely the problem, Stephen. These coalition agreements in South Africa, they're not public. I anticipate that this year will be different. We may see some public coalition agreements coming out. And I have seen a few of these coalition agreements. That's obviously private. But what I've noted is that these coalition agreements are often vague, and they do not contain these minimum criteria that ought to be reflected in these coalition agreements. So in practice, if these coalition agreements aren't public, then there's nothing that can otherwise persuade these political parties to actually cooperate in the coalition. But I anticipate that if it is public, then it can create some checks and balances, in the sense that the opposition parties as well as the civil society can then become privy to the details that's reflected in those coalition agreements, and hold the political parties accountable for their performance with regards to their commitments in the agreement. So I think it can definitely add some persuasive value to these coalition agreements, because at the moment, because they are not public, there's nothing that can persuade political parties to cooperate. But if it is public, then they know that their voters will be watching them, their voters will be monitoring their performance, and it can possibly cost them their votes in the elections if they do not cooperate.
Sorry to interrupt. Jennica, I can think of plenty of reasons why political parties would not want to make these public. And one of them could easily be because they're actually using patronage. They're not talking about good governance at all. They're actually just talking about literally parceling out, sharing out positions in a council to each other, you know, positions in the council entities, all sorts of things. So in other words, I mean, if I was sharing patronage in a coalition agreement, I wouldn't make that public either.
Well, I want to start by saying that patronage is not in and of itself a bad thing. It's as a point of departure, it must be stated that the political parties, as being partners in government, they ought to be able to expect to occupy one or more of the offices in a municipality. But that being said, it's not always advantageous to advertise everything in a coalition agreement. And we also can't expect them to divulge every part of the negotiation process. So there is essentially certain parts of the coalition agreement that can be made public, in particular the coalition program that relates to what the parties intend to achieve in terms of service delivery in the municipality.
We don't really have a good tradition of coalitions. In fact, we have a short and pretty bad tradition of coalitions. We've had one or two that have worked. And the reason that this is important is it seems to me, and this in a way is hanging over all of these conversations, is that no matter what happens in 24, it seems very likely to me that the ANC will lose Gauteng, and that there will need to be a coalition in Gauteng. There may even need to be a coalition in national government. So how important is what's happening now in terms of coalition discussions, parties getting used to the idea, forming coalition, writing coalition agreements, publishing them, whether they do that through WhatsApp or whether they actually tweet them themselves rather than leaking doesn't really matter. But how important is what's happening now in terms of what could happen in just 3 years' time?
Yeah, so yes, I agree with you. These coalitions have, many of them have been unstable, and they often don't even last for a 5-year council term. If they do, they are really unstable. But we haven't seen that in our practice. But I want to say also that I think that these political parties, they've learned a great deal from their practices in the past. They've learned, we've seen that during the campaigning period, they learned the lesson that ideology matters. It matters who these coalition partners are in a coalition, because it matters for them in terms of reaching agreements, making reaching agreements easier. But I think that there will be some trial and error in the run-up to the national elections, but they should essentially reflect on that. And I don't anticipate we will see a coalition in the national elections, but I'm not a political analyst. I'm a lawyer, so I'm not going to comment on that as of yet.
In my experience, lawyers sometimes are more accurate than political analysts. Sometimes they aren't. Jennica, can I ask, I mean, this is a slightly different question. I suppose it is a political question, but I think it also matters. So, I mean, everyone talks about, all the time, people talk about the countries that are used to having coalitions. And there's something that some of these countries have in common. So, I mean, people talk about Norway, they talk about Denmark, they talk endlessly about Denmark, they talk about Germany, they talk about the Netherlands, they talk about Belgium. With the exception of Belgium, these countries are very similar to each other. They're very homogenous. The people are very similar. Yes. They're similar in many ways, culturally, linguistically, they're similar ethnically. But perhaps more important than all of those things, and those things are important, is that they're similar in terms of class. We have the highest inequality in the world, and it's racialized inequality, plus a whole lot of other things on top of it. I mean, I think we sometimes underestimate the role of ethnicity and language groups in our country. So where I'm trying to get to is, could we find it much harder in our country and in our politics to form durable, sustainable, workable coalitions, because the parties are representing constituencies that are so far apart?
Yes. No, definitely. This is actually one of the main topics that I'm highlighting in my doctoral thesis, is that, yes, while we can take many lessons from European countries, we must take into account that the context within which those coalitions operate looks very different from ours. In our context, we must consider that there's historical factors that is at play, and there's so much division in our political landscape that makes it difficult for the political parties to establish a political will to actually cooperate and work with each other. But that's also why I think coalitions is actually good for nation building, in the sense that it forces these political parties to come together despite their differences, and to force them to accommodate the preferences, and also through that, to innovate, because it will be that in the long term, I anticipate that we will see more centrist parties emerging in the political landscape, because of coalitions, because it will contribute to more mature politicking. Indeed, that is what is necessary if we want these coalitions to work. Political parties won't be able, despite being so diverse, they cannot adopt these extreme positions in these coalitions. So it will force them to move more towards the center in order to meet one another.
What does your gut tell you? Are we going to have better coalitions this time around? Have we learned from what happened 5 years ago?
Stephen,
the cynicism of the lawyer coming out.
I don't want to say anything, but I think in some instances we may see some stable coalitions, but it will be difficult because, especially in the context where these political parties have a minimal majority coalitions, because even if they manage to cooperate in that context, then the opposition may become a problem, because it's easy for that opposition to then destabilize a coalition in the council through, for example, staging a walkout to deprive them of the quorum that's necessary to continue a meeting in the council. So it becomes difficult to then adopt budgets and so forth. So I think political parties will have to also consider what they can do to protect their majority. So in our framework, we, for example, recommend that they need to consider increasing the size of their coalition to ensure that they, for example, maintain a 55% majority instead of a 50+1, because in that context it becomes more difficult to then disrupt that council meeting, because even if they work out, they would still have their majority. So they need to be strategic about what they can do in order to also manage external conflict coming from outside of the coalition.
Jennica Beukes, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate the time. Important when you consider the maths in the city of Joburg, for example, how difficult it's going to be to get together a coalition there.